You've probably heard the story of Jesus' disciples. Among Jesus' disciples, there were 12 who were considered his truest and closest followers. Each possessed unique abilities and was the one Jesus trusted the most. And you're right. But look closer. Something doesn't add up. One of them couldn't control his temper. One of them stole money from the group he was supposed to serve. One of them looked Jesus in the face and said, "I don't believe you're alive," even after the resurrection. And one of them sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. These weren't polished leaders. These were broken men, ordinary, struggling, disqualified by every standard the world uses. So why them? Why would Jesus, who could have chosen anyone, walk up to a tax collector sitting in a booth everyone despised and say two words, "Here's what nobody tells you. There is a pattern hidden inside these 12 stories, not random, not accidental, deliberate. And when you see it, everything you believe about your own failures, your own doubts, your own worthiness will never look the same again." Most people think the disciples were special, hand-picked because they were the best, the brightest, the most spiritually qualified men in all of Israel. We imagine Jesus scanning the crowd, looking for the strongest, the most faithful, the ones already close to God, and then choosing those men. That's the version we grew up with. But that's not what actually happened. Look at who he passed over: the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, men who had memorized the entire Torah, men who fasted twice a week, men who had dedicated their entire lives to religious service. Jesus walked right past them and went to the lake, where fishermen smelled like fish and argued about nets, where a tax collector sat in a booth counting Rome's money, while his own people spat on the ground when they walked by him, where a political radical carried a knife under his robe and dreamed of revolution. These were the men Jesus chose. Not the qualified, not the prepared, not the already holy. So here's the question that should stop you cold. If Jesus didn't choose them because they were worthy, then what was he looking for? And more importantly, what does that mean for you? Here's what I want you to see. There is a pattern running through every single one of these 12 men, not in their strengths, in their broken places. Peter's impulsiveness, Thomas's doubt, Matthew's greed, Simon's rage, Judas's betrayal. Most people read these as flaws to overlook, but Jesus didn't overlook them. He chose because of them. There's something hidden in the way Jesus built his team, something most Bible studies never slow down long enough to show you. Every man he called carried a wound. Every man he called had already failed at something. Every man he called was, by the world's standard, the wrong choice. And yet, 12 broken men, 3 years with Jesus, and they turned the ancient world completely upside down. Here's what I'm going to show you today. The pattern Jesus used to choose his disciples is the same pattern he is using in your life, right now, in the middle of your failure, in the middle of your doubt, in the middle of whatever has made you feel like you are too far gone to be used by God. You're not too far gone. You're exactly who he's looking for. First century Judea, a land under occupation, Roman soldiers on every corner, Roman taxes crushing every family, Roman law deciding who lived and who died. The Jewish people had been waiting, for centuries, for a deliverer, a Messiah, someone who would come and set everything right. The tension in the air was not spiritual. It was desperate. And into that world, Jesus of Nazareth began to teach. Not in the temple, not in the synagogues of Jerusalem, on hillsides, on fishing boats, on the dusty roads between small towns, nobody important ever came from. He spoke to people the religious system had already dismissed: the sick, the poor, the unclean, the outcast. And the crowds followed him, not because he promised political power, but because something in his words touched a place inside them that religion had never reached. Now understand this. In that culture, a rabbi choosing his disciples was everything. A student didn't choose his teacher. The teacher chose him. And to be chosen meant something profound. It meant the rabbi looked at you and said, "You have what it takes. You can become like me." Which makes what Jesus did next almost impossible to understand. He didn't go to Jerusalem. He went to Galilee, a backwater region, looked down upon, dismissed. He stood on the edge of a lake, smelled the fish, heard the nets hitting the water, and called men that no other rabbi had wanted. That detail is not insignificant. That detail is everything. Let's start with Peter, Simon, a fisherman from Bethsaida. The day Jesus called him, Peter didn't have a clean record. He wasn't a man of measured words and careful decisions. He was reactive, impulsive, loud, the kind of man who acted before he thought and spoke before he listened. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Peter." Rock. Stop right there. Jesus didn't call him what he was. He called him what he would become. A man who couldn't control his temper. Jesus named him the Rock. A man who would deny Christ 3 times before sunrise. Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." That is not logic. That is not strategy. That is something else entirely. Now watch what happens. Peter walks on water, then sinks. Peter declares Jesus is the Messiah, then tries to talk him out of the cross. Peter draws a sword in the garden, cutting off a servant's ear in blind rage. Peter swears he will never abandon Jesus, and then, standing by a fire in the cold courtyard, denies him. Once, twice, 3 times. And the rooster crows. Peter goes outside and weeps bitterly. Here's what's strange. Jesus already knew this was coming. He told Peter it would happen, before it happened. And he still chose him. Still named him Rock. Still said, "You will feed my sheep." Why would Jesus invest everything into a man he knew would fall? Unless falling wasn't the disqualifying factor Jesus was counting. Something else was being measured. Something most of us completely miss. Now look at Thomas. Same pattern, different wound. Thomas wasn't weak, don't misread him. Earlier in John's Gospel, when Jesus announced he was returning to Judea, where people had just tried to stone him, the disciples froze. Nobody wanted to go. Thomas was the one who stood up and said, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." That is not a coward talking. That is a man who loved Jesus enough to walk toward death. But then the cross happened, and something broke inside Thomas. He had given everything, believed completely, followed without hesitation, and then he watched Jesus die. The dream didn't just end. It was executed, publicly, brutally, without mercy. So when the other disciples came running, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas couldn't do it. He couldn't afford to believe again, not without proof, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, unless I put my finger where the nails were, unless I put my hand into his side. I will not believe. 8 days pass. Thomas sitting alone with that doubt. 8 days of silence from heaven. Then Jesus appears. Doesn't rebuke Thomas first. Doesn't lecture him. Walks straight to him. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." And then, "Stop doubting and believe." Thomas collapses. "My Lord and my God." The most complete declaration of faith in all 4 Gospels. From the man everyone remembers as the doubter. See the pattern now? Peter fell through impulsive failure. Thomas fell through grief and broken trust. Both hit the bottom. Both were met there, by Jesus. Not after they recovered. This is not coincidence. This is method. Now here's the one that should wreck you completely. Matthew. In first-century Jewish society, tax collectors weren't just disliked. They were considered traitors. They worked for Rome, the occupying empire. The enemy. They overcharged their own people, pocketing the difference. Legal extortion. Protected by Roman soldiers with swords. Every Jew who walked past Matthew's tax booth felt it. The shame, the rage, the betrayal. Matthew sat behind that booth every single day, knowing exactly what they thought of him. And one morning, Jesus walked past. He didn't slow down to debate Matthew's life choices. Didn't hand him a scroll of repentance requirements. Didn't say, "Clean yourself up and maybe we'll talk." He stopped, looked at Matthew directly. 2 words, and Matthew got up, left everything. The booth, the money, the security, the only identity he had built, however corrupt, for years. Just got up and followed. That night, Matthew threw a party. Not a quiet dinner, a party. Filled with tax collectors, sinners. Every person the religious establishment had written off. And Jesus sat down at the table with all of them. The Pharisees were furious. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus heard them, didn't apologize. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now connect this. Peter, the failure who denied Christ, became the voice of Pentecost. 3,000 saved in one sermon. Thomas, the doubter who demanded proof, tradition says, traveled further than almost any other apostle, all the way to India, dying for the faith he once refused to believe. Matthew, the traitor nobody trusted, wrote the gospel that has introduced more people to Jesus than perhaps any other document in human history. The most broken men produce the most fruit. This is not accidental theology. This is a deliberate, recurring, unmistakable pattern, and it points to something hidden beneath the surface of every single one of these stories. Something that changes everything. Here's where it gets deep. Stay with me. In the original Greek of the New Testament, when Jesus says to Peter, "Follow me," the word used is "dute opiso mu," come after me. Not join my movement, not sign up for my ministry. Come after me. It is the language of a journey, a rabbi saying, walk where I walk, step where I step, become what I am. But there's something else buried in that phrase. In Hebrew culture, when a rabbi chose a student, the blessing spoken over that student was this: may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi, meaning, may you follow so closely behind your teacher that the dust his sandals kick up lands on you. Not beside him, not ahead of him, behind him, close enough to be covered in his dust. Now look at who Jesus chose. Fishermen, not scholars. Men whose hands were calloused from nets, not scrolls. Men who had already been passed over by every other rabbi in the region. Because in that culture, if no rabbi had chosen you by a certain age, you went home. You accepted it. You were not good enough to carry the teaching forward. Peter, Andrew, James, John. They had already been told, quietly, systematically, by the silence of every rabbi who didn't call their name, you didn't make the cut. And then Jesus came and chose them anyway. The Greek word for this choosing is eklegomai, to select, to call out from among others. But deeper than that, it carries the meaning of deliberate preference, not settling, wanting. Jesus didn't settle for these men. He wanted these men, specifically, personally, by name. That word, eklegomai, is the same word used when Scripture describes how God chose you, before the foundation of the world. Now let's bring it all together. 12 men, different backgrounds, different wounds, different ways of failing. Peter failed through impulse. Thomas failed through doubt. Matthew failed through compromise. Simon the Zealot failed through rage. James and John failed through pride, asking for thrones while Jesus was walking toward a cross. Every single one of them. Broken in a different place. But here's the pattern. The one hiding in plain sight. Jesus never chose a single man who had it together. Not one. He didn't build his church on the spiritually polished. He built it on the cracked. Because here's what cracks do. They let the light through. Think about Peter's denial. 3 times he said, "I do not know him." 3 times. After the resurrection, Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" One restoration for every betrayal. That is not coincidence. That is covenant. Think about Thomas's doubt. 8 days Jesus waited. He could have appeared immediately. He didn't. He let Thomas sit in the silence long enough to make the moment of belief unforgettable. Think about Matthew's party. The moment Matthew got up from that booth, he didn't go quietly. He threw open the doors, invited everyone the world had rejected. Because a man who has been found cannot stop telling others where to look. This is the pattern. God does not wait for you to fix yourself before he calls you. He calls you in the middle of the breaking. He names you what you will become. Before you look anything like it, he sits at your table, the one filled with every shameful thing, and calls it the beginning. 12 broken men, no platform, no degree, no religious credential, just a willingness to get up and follow. And they changed the entire world. The question was never whether you are qualified. The question Jesus is asking, right now, is the same 2 words he spoke on the edge of that lake. That's the pattern. That's always been the pattern. Maybe you're sitting with something heavy right now. A failure you can't stop replaying. A doubt you're ashamed to admit out loud. A version of yourself you're convinced God can no longer use. You look at your life and you see the denial, the betrayal, the doubt, the compromise. And somewhere deep down, you've started to believe the lie. I've gone too far. I've wasted too much time. Someone like me doesn't get a second chapter. But Peter got one. Thomas got one. Matthew got one. And the same Jesus who stood on the edge of that lake, who walked into a locked room where Thomas was hiding, who sat down at a table full of broken people and called it fellowship, that same Jesus is standing in the middle of your story, right now, not waiting for you to get it together, not standing at a distance until you clean yourself up. Here, in the mess, in the silence, in the place you are most ashamed of. He is not looking for the qualified. He never was. He is looking for the willing. And if you're still watching this, if something in these words found the exact place in you that needed to hear it, then you already know. This wasn't an accident. You were covered in his dust before you even knew you were following.